All right. I hope everybody had a good week and weekend since the last time we were together. My weekend was just a little bit crazy. I had several stained glass windows to get done so I could deliver them yesterday, and so I did not sleep very much. I worked extra hard, got everything done, and then Sunday I drove up north to deliver the windows. And yesterday I dropped them off, and thankfully the family is incredibly happy with them, which is always nice. But I wanted to point out something. You'll notice perhaps that there's something missing. There was Research and Discovery Project 6 right around here. I took that out. So we only have 5 projects. I removed that from everything. Um, and I wanted to just reiterate a little bit about that. We have the project guidelines, and there are research projects, 3 different styles of research projects that I described in these 3 paragraphs. And 3 different styles of or 3 different ways of presenting discovery projects, which I describe as well here. I am still these 3 different ways. I am still working on defining the AI project. If somebody wants to do that for a 4th or 5th project, that's just fine, but I will get that done, in the next week or so, I'm hoping, and we'll go through it on Tuesday so everybody knows what's involved. And that is a different way of processing the tools of artistic critique and applying them if you have access to an AI image generator. And I thought that that would be I'm sorry, I thought I was sharing this tab. I wasn't. So this is the project guidelines revisited. As I mentioned, here's the 3 different types of research projects and the 3 different types of presentations for discovery projects. And then I'll add on to this as well the information about the AI project, which will be essentially you will um, find an art movement or an art period or an artist that you particularly like, a style, something like that. You'll uh, collect examples of imagery of that style or movement or period or artist. You'll also select a couple identifiers that are important, like colors, textures, where the lighting comes from, and you'll ask AI to generate an image using your input and a specific style of prompt. You'll evaluate that first image, make a couple changes, have it generate a second image, and then talk about whether or not that is more successful and the entire process. And you can do it present it either as a written thing or as a video. And like I said, I will give more details to that um, on Tuesday, next Tuesday. So the module that we're talking about this week is we're last week we talked about romanticism and realism. This week, we're moving a little bit closer to the present day. So last week, we're dealt with about, I want to say 1815 to about 1870, 1880. And it's 19th century romanticism and realism. What is interesting to me at this time period, we mentioned a little bit last week that people are, there's a much broader spectrum of middle income possessors. So the market for art production has shifted. Who are you making things for? Then we also have there are artists that are not working necessarily for a studio or for the patronage of a large family or a church or anything like that. We have starting in about 1820, I want to say, we have artists that are able to get a hold of art supplies that are the cheapest they've ever been up until that point. And they start doing stuff because they feel called or impelled to do it, as opposed to creating artwork that is solely as commissions. This is not all artists. Artists are still doing a lot. There's still a lot of commission work for royal families and things like that, and that still continues today. But it's shifting. And artists, rather than producing art for cultural consumption, art that portrays the values and symbols that are important to the culture that the artist lives within. Artists now, by the end of the 19th century, they're getting to a point where they're generating the confidence and skill set necessary to show other people how they view the world, not just show how everybody expects the world to look. And this is why a discussion about art movements and periods and this difference is important, because instead of artists being solely participants within a culture, now they are also being critics of a culture. And a critic is not somebody who points out flaws. That's not what criticism is. Criticism is being self-reflective, both as an individual and as a culture, being able to identify things that maybe the rest of the culture doesn't see about themselves, and using those as elements of production or creativity. So I'm going to watch this. I was not having a difficult time earlier with showing videos. So please let me know in the chat if there's any problems with that. I'm going to turn on the sound, and we're going to listen to just a little bit.
Divided into periods and movements.
Okay, she said art history is divided into periods and movements. Colton, did you hear that in the video? Okay, excellent. So we're going to go ahead and start this over again, and we're going to watch this. It's less than 3 minutes, but I think it's a really good encapsulation of the difference between art periods and movements.
Art history is divided into periods and movements. The difference between the two is time and intent. Art periods are based on historical eras, and unlike art movements, they aren't consciously formed by artists. Art historians group their art together because they're made during the same time in the same geographical location, so they share a lot of similarities in their cultures, religions, and taste in art subjects. For example, medieval art is made during the medieval time, so right after the fall of Rome and right before the Renaissance. Pretty straightforward, right? So there's the prehistorical period, Mesopotamian period, Egyptian period, Byzantine period, Renaissance period, Baroque period, and that's just a few of them. An art movement is formed by a group of artists, usually with a set goal, and they can have an associated art style or a shared ideology. They usually have meetings, manifestos, and publications that clearly state their goals, basically what they think art should be. Some art movements include realism, impressionism, expressionism, cubism, surrealism, and pop art. The line between periods and movements isn't always clear, but while periods were designated after the fact, movements were formed by artists. They may have not called themselves that, like the Mannerists didn't call themselves Mannerists, but they had a same set of goal and ideology that they aspired to, that set them apart from any church or state's regulation of what good art is. Art made today is sort of grouped under this larger umbrella of contemporary art, but maybe in the future they'll have more descriptive names than just contemporary, because I can see that being really confusing. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, now is a perfect time to transition into my outro and prompt you to go watch my What's the Difference Between Modern and Contemporary Art video. In it I go over...
We don't need to listen to the rest of that. But so essentially the difference, and I like that because she is pretty concise talking about art periods and movements. What we have talked about before last week were essentially art periods that are bound by constraints of time and culture. So, the expanse of the culture. For example, the Italian Renaissance happened in primarily Italy. The Northern European Renaissance happened primarily in Northern Europe. And the time periods were essentially a generation after the Last Crusade, up until the end of the 15th century for Renaissance periods. And but as we get closer to time, the present day, we shift from those periods to art movements that, like I said, are reflective of the artist considering the culture that they're living in. The time is shorter, in part because things are culturally across the world are changing as communications and travel technologies expand. Uh, what is, by the end of the 19th century, we have seen over a 100-year period, people going from, if you're going to move to another continent, it is a major life change and you will never move back. You're not going to see your parents that you left behind in Europe. Going around the world, yeah, it would only take less than a year or two, but it is still a significant risk factor. And then 100 years later, at the end of the 19th century, people can not only talk to each other across the Atlantic Ocean, but people can also travel around the entire world in less than a couple months, which has not happened in recorded history before that point anywhere. And this, so we get an incredible rapid transition through technologies of all sorts, which means that people are changing constantly how they interact with the world, how they interact with the things in the world around them. And this also means that as artists are giving themselves permission to show the world how they show everybody how they see the world themselves and reflect on those things, because they're able to communicate with each other and share each other ideas with each other in these art movements, that then the time between art movements is going to change because the cultural context behind the movements is changing rapidly as well. I hope that makes sense. And one of the things I mentioned is that movements, an artist like Van Gogh participated in half a dozen movements during his life. He's most notable for the expressionism that he did, but no, yeah, 3 or 4 different movements through his life. He's most notable for the expressionism that he did, and when you think of a Van Gogh painting, that's the kind of stuff that you mostly think of. Then we also get people like Piet Mondrian, who started off as an impressionist, kind of a romantic impressionist, and uh, went through several different art movements, participated in several different art movements, and became a bridge artist or Jugendstil. And he was one of the people that defined that movement, and that pretty much defined how he saw the world until the point that he died. So, and he participated in 6 or 8 different movements. And so, when before, even 200 years earlier, people lived and died within the periods that they were in, and they participated in that period because that was part of the culture that they lived within. So a period is going to last sometimes, many times more than a single lifetime, but a single lifetime may encompass several different movements. And that's something that can be confusing about art history, because a lot of the times we use words that should be synonyms but aren't actually synonyms. They're used, different words are used specifically because they have different implications. Now, Himalath Klimt is one of my favorite artists, and we'll get back and talk about this in just a little bit. But one of the things I want to talk about is, from the Renaissance on, we have looked at things where people have dealt specifically, for the most part, with realistic portrayal of the world around them. In Romanticism and realism, we can still identify a person as a person. We can still identify a tree as a tree, because the artist specifically is using visual imagery that symbolizes thing in the way that, without any other context of the painting, we can still recognize it as symbols that we share. As we move closer to the present day, the end of the 19th century, and artists are giving themselves permission more and more often to show other people how they view the world. Their visual language of representation becomes more individual. And this is how we get to more abstraction and non-objectivism. And we're going to come back up here again, and we're going to watch this little video. But before we get there, I want to demonstrate what the difference is, what the differences are between realistic portrayal in art and how do we move towards abstractionism. So this first image right here, it is a painting, and I hope you can identify it easily as a painting of a tree. This is a very naturalistic portrayal of a tree. I mean, most of us, when we look at a tree, this is the kind of thing that we recognize as a tree that we see. And the next one is, this is right. If you remember when we're looking at arts of the Mughal Empire and Turkey, people were doing a lot of stuff that was stylistic, and it was done for very significant religious and philosophical reasons. That's why they were using stylism. And the stylization of an image becomes really important as a reflection of the culture that they're living within. But we move away a little bit from the naturalism of the tree. I mean, you can still see, yeah, this kind of reeds. This reeds is a realistic tree, at least the bark and the branches. But if you saw that every single leaf on a tree was flat and facing you, that would feel really weird. So this artist is starting to use stylization. The birds, you notice that the birds have a very specific way their wings are displayed. You know, they seem to be right in the middle of getting ready to land, where their wings are collapsed in on them. There's not an awful lot of variation where the wings are outstretched and flapping. It looks like they're all about in the same position. And we look at these birds that are not flying, they're in a silhouette, so we can easily identify what they are. Most of the squirrels, same kind of thing. They are in pretty identifiable as squirrels because they're being shown mostly in silhouettes. This is an example of stylization. And you can see the person right here. We can recognize this as a human being. It's detailed enough we can even probably recognize this as a specific human being if we saw them. And we look at these plants, they're portrayed almost like botanical specimens as opposed to plants the way that they would be really truly seen in a natural setting. And this is done specifically in this is from a name, or a miniature book. Well, they're miniature paintings. It's in a full-size book. This is about the size of a notebook page. And they are designed specifically to portray an element of reality that is outside of the normal, everyday, natural world. It's to give you just a little bit of a sense of timelessness, and that's one of the major reasons why the leaves and the animals and the plants are stylistically portrayed. So we're moving a little bit away from realism. And here, this is from Japan, and what is really interesting about this is we can tell that this is more stylization. It's even more stylized, where this is water, but instead of portraying the water as naturalistically appearing water, we get this stylized ribbons of water that becomes kind of almost a visual trope for how water is represented in a lot of woodblock prints after this. And we do get I don't know if you recognize this kind of splashing water imagery from one of the views of Mount Fuji that is now used by a lot of the shave ice places, the Hawaiian shave ice places, where it's that breaking wave. And we get these areas here that are green with the blue edging on it. This is actually the landmass. of the island that this takes place on. And then the tree branch, or this actual tree, the bark is very twisted and gnarled, but again, it's reminiscent of a tree branch, but it's heavily stylized. All the fruits are in the same stage of development. All the flowers are either facing you perfectly or they're in perfect profile. All the leaves we can see dead on. So this kind of um, is stylized in a similar way to the Name or a miniature painting that we saw just a minute ago, except it's even more stylized. In this case, you can tell the land and the water only really if you have the context of what this is. You know, if you don't know, if you just saw an image of this, you wouldn't know what it was. If you just saw an image of this, the water, you wouldn't know what it was. It would just look like stripes. And that is an indication that we're moving even closer to an idea of abstraction. This is the image I thought I was sharing. I'm sorry if I did not share that very well. But you can see the ribbons of the water. You can see the green and blue of the land. But again, if you just saw this corner, you wouldn't know of any idea what it is. You just saw this area, you wouldn't have any idea what it is because you really need the contextual clues to be aware of what it is. Now, going back to the module image, I'm going to try to share this. This is a carpet. It's stylized after the transoceanic carpets from Persia and Turkey. And I'm hoping that you can kind of see the same kind of stylization as we saw that is very similar to those two paintings we just looked at, the miniature painting and then the Japanese style painting. Again, the flowers are stylized. It's, you know, perfect head-on botanical specimen style flower. The leaves, same kind of thing. They're all flattened out. And in this case, we don't even have a differentiated background. You know, the background is all a solid color. It's even more stylized. The branches are very simplified. And the vines here on the left and the right are very stylized and simplified. So they became more ribbons directing your eye through the piece. This is the pink flower on the left that my mouse is circling around is kind of like a stylized lotus. And you're going to be still seeing stylized carnations and, you know, other stylized chrysanthemums, different things like that, but they are very stylized. Notice that the petals are all basically the same shape and the leaves are all basically the same shape. And here again, in this garden type imagery, it's all very stylized. The plants all look like botanical specimens. They're not firmly grounded in a believable background. They're surrounded by that same blue color. So it's more stylized even than the Name or the Japanese painting that we saw just a second ago. So the stylization, as the stylization increases, we're getting closer to the abstraction that I mentioned. And then this is a flag from New England, which is one of the early versions of the American flag. And I thought that this was important to show because we can still identify this as a tree. All these images have been of trees, but see the level of stylization has increased to the point where really the only way that we know that this is a tree and not an arrowhead is, well, we have Liberty Tree labeled above it, and then we also see that this is a green color. If you actually were out hiking and saw something like this standing up, it would be kind of freaky because that's not how a tree really looks. But the simplification is such that in the language context, we identify this as being a tree. And there's a lot of examples today with road signs and things like that that use that kind of symbolism where it is an abstraction or stylized tree to the point where without the context, you wouldn't know what it was. Now, this is a kanji that represents a tree in Japanese. And the vertical line right here represents the tree trunk. These diagonals represent the sloping lines, like in the New England image, the sloping lines of that tree. That's what these diagonals are in the kanji. And then the horizontal line is like a horizon line. It represents the land or the horizon behind where the tree is. And the only reason we know that this is a tree is because of with contextual cues. And it's used in it's Japanese kanji. It is a symbol that represents the word for a tree, but you can see that it is heavily abstracted from that original tree idea. It is no longer naturalistic or realistic on any level. And then even more removed from that, we see this is a more contemporary painting that is a landscape. And here, the trees, the only way we can identify the trees as being trees is because they're masses of color. And occasionally we get these vertical strokes that could very well be trunks. This, when they stylize and simplify to the point where you no longer can tell what it is without very specific contextual cues, this is when it fits firmly into the realm of abstraction. And I want to show this in just a little bit, but and you can really see that. This process really starts as people become more and more interested in self-expression as artists, showing the world how they see it, and as buyers are looking for more and more different and interesting things to consume now that they have the power to buy their own stuff instead of just looking at paintings that other people have bought to display, which kind of describes a lot of those paintings we've been seeing up until the week before last week. I do want to share this video. I like this because it talks a little bit about what we are seeing when we look, or how to see abstraction in a painting. This can be very intimidating, and I'm going to try to do my best to provide some context for a lot of the imagery that we see to help so that it's a little bit easier to wrap our brains around it. The name of this painting is City Landscape. It was done in 1955. And I really like this. It is about 5 minutes long, but I want to watch the whole thing. And we're going to kind of go through how to look at a painting so that it is not quite so intimidating. And we'll talk more about it as we move forward.
We're in the galleries of the Art Institute of Chicago, and we're looking at a large painting. It's brilliantly colored, and it's abstract. We wanted to spend a little time just looking.
And we want to think about ways in which those of us who maybe don't encounter abstraction on a regular basis can find entry points.
Abstraction can seem difficult. It's easy to dismiss quickly, and it really does take a little bit of our commitment to make sense of it.
One of the things about abstraction is that you benefit from taking more time. So I'd like to have us just start by glancing across the canvas and finding a color that stands out to you, and trace not only the color, but the way the color is applied.
I'm looking at this beautiful bright blue. You see traces of it in the top third of the canvas, but then you see more in the central area, and none of those lines are straight. They seem like signatures. They turn and reverse on themselves. And while some of that blue exists on the surface, some of it seems underneath. And all of a sudden, I'm aware of a kind of space. Suddenly, this canvas doesn't feel flat to me.
There are places where I feel like couldn't even begin to get in between the brushstrokes. They're so ensnarled with one another. And then there are places which seem to open up as if they expand back into space.
The denser central passages feel activated to me. The word I would use is energy. There seems to be a colliding of color and stroke and tone.
I'm really drawn to the pink, which is largely underneath those blues that you noticed.
There's a section of the pink that almost seems to reveal the linen, and then I start to look for that same feature elsewhere, and I see it in other spots as well, with aqua or blue or yellow.
And some areas seem very intentional, where we can feel the movement of the artist's hand, and then other areas feel rather accidental, where the paint is dripping down.
And so all of a sudden this painting feels archaeological, as if we're able to reveal earlier moments in its creative process.
Let's think about this title, City Landscape. When you look at the painting, do you start to conjure up a memory of a city landscape?
The title is tricky for me because it closes down the openness of the meaning of the painting. It's a little bit like when you read a book. You have your own ideas about what a character looks like, but then you go see the movie and a director has made that decision for you. In an interesting way, you lose something.
But I want to challenge the idea that it can't also invite us in to bring our own personal interpretations and let just the prompt of city landscape open up a new avenue for exploration of this painting.
There's such a variety in the application of paint. All of those differences make me think about the bombardment of all the different kinds of things that one experiences in a city.
It's a kind of cacophony.
There are different questions that this painting poses for us. One of them is, how do we engage with abstraction? How do we understand it in the larger context of abstract expressionism?
Joan Mitchell, although she comes from Chicago, goes to New York, eventually to Paris, and has lived through the Second World War and is spending time with abstract expressionists. She is throwing off the yoke of representation that had ruled painting for centuries, and there was a tremendous assertion of freedom, of exploration that existed at this historical moment.
For me, it's enormously pleasurable to stand and just look at the paint and to imagine the brushstrokes and to indulge in the oranges and the yellows and the blues and the pinks and the magentas and all the different kinds of grays and creams that we see. But it's also just as interesting to think about why abstraction emerged in the United States after World War II. What did it mean at that moment? And those are questions that are really interesting to consider.
And I think it can be useful when you look at abstract painting to think about music without words. In a sense, what an abstract painting is asking us to do is to be satisfied with composition, color, brushwork, tonalities, the way that we're satisfied with notes and rhythms and harmonies in music. Music doesn't always need words, and painting doesn't always need to represent something. It can simply sometimes just be itself.
What I like about this short video is it brought up some really good points. So this cityscape, this painting is about 5 feet by 5 feet. It is a large painting. And I liked how they showed some images of Chicago. Let's see if I can find one of those next to the painting. Like right here, we see the Chicago, we see the painting. What is fascinating to me is I don't see specific buildings. I don't see specific people or actual physical elements. And I wonder if Joan Mitchell is using her color and her shapes as a symbol for her feelings about the city and what she's observing. You know, maybe all the different colors, the blue, the pink, the yellow, the orange, represent things like all the different kinds of noises that we hear in a cityscape. Or maybe it represents the different kinds of cultures that kind of are mashed together within a city. And maybe these kind of shapes of brushstrokes are symbols that she uses to indicate the presence of human activity. Not anything specific, but just that atmosphere of human activity. And I think that that might be consistent because as we move away, if we see this as the center of a city, as we move away from the center of the city, where there's going to be a more diluted concentration of people, that kind of energy of all the different colors and brushes strokes coming together dissipates and opens up. And so I see this as symbolic of human activity in a localized area that kind of spreads out as we move away from the center of a city. Now, whether or not that's true or real, I, it doesn't matter so much. One of the things that is interesting to me about abstraction is the fact that as people participate in looking at abstract arts, at abstract paintings, they see more and more what they want to see. This is it's something called pareidolia, where we overlay meaning and order on something that doesn't necessarily that wasn't intentionally made for that meaning and order that we ascribe to it. And looking at imagery as we look at abstractionism or other things like that, it, like a Rorschach test, it provides us an opportunity to articulate our own responses, and we can find validation in the painting as we look at it. Now, Courtney, she's a remarkable person. She's in charge of the art department at UVU, but she is talking a little bit about difference between abstraction and non-objective art. We talk about abstraction, it's stylization, simplification, different things like that. Biggest difference between abstraction and non-objective art is that abstraction is stylizing and simplifying something that's in front of the artist. Whether or not they're painting their emotions or they're simplifying shapes that they see, they're responding to something in front of them that exists in the real world. Non-objective art is where an artist is expressing something that has never existed in the observable world. Things like sounds and emotions, stuff like that. So this is only about 2 minutes long, and we're going to listen to what Courtney has to say.
Now, as we're looking at abstraction, we look at the other side of the scale, we can move into the realm of complete abstraction. Hello, my name is Courtney Davis, and I'm an associate professor of art history here at UVU. And today we'll be talking about abstract versus non-objective art. Simply put, abstract art does not try to replicate reality. As opposed to focusing on an illusionistic representation like the Renaissance window on the world that depicted space that was very believable, almost like a portal you could walk into, abstract art focuses on line, color, shape, and form in a new type of visual communication. Now, abstraction can vary on a scale between full and partial. With partial abstraction, we oftentimes see representations from the world that are simplified in some way. Think about Claude Monet's paintings of haystacks or water lily ponds. As you step aside, as you step back, you can see the representational form. You know what you're looking at. But as you get closer and closer, the scene begins to dissipate and it becomes very, very abstracted. As we look at artworks like Paul Cézanne's landscapes, we oftentimes see representational forms that are simplified into basic shapes like cylinders, spheres, and cubes. Now, we oftentimes associate abstraction with modernism, although it has deep roots in art history. We could look back to Islamic calligraphy and geometric patterns. We could look to the Byzantine era with mosaics and other simplified forms, or even back to ancient art. Now, as we're looking at abstraction, we look at the other side of the scale, we can move into the realm of complete abstraction. Think of Yves Klein's blue monochromes, just a canvas filled with blue pigment. With full abstraction, we oftentimes have geometric forms, but not always. There can be a lot of variation. However, sometimes we call fully abstract works non-objective. Now, I like to think about non-objective art as always being abstract, but not all abstract art is non-objective. Non-objective art simply means that the artist isn't looking back to reality for a reference. And there you have it, the differences between abstract art versus non-objective.
I hope that makes sense, but the reason why we're covering this right now is because as we move closer to the present day, we're going to see a lot of material that we need to have these reference points in order to navigate them. Now, why is Hilma af Klint's painting important to this? And one of the reasons why this is so important is that Hilma did a lot of beautiful landscapes that were part of the Impressionist movement, but she started experimenting with things that she was taking shapes that she was comfortable with, like letters, for example. You see a W here, O, cursive A, different things like that. She was taking forms that she liked, like this spiral of a shell, that were not ever intended to be seen as naturalistic on any level. What she's doing instead is expressing a visual imagery of emotions, thoughts, and ideas that she has inside without writing them out or without making music, without singing them. She's expressing these interior thoughts in a way that is unique to her and how she navigates an understanding of the world. But she's making these paintings that don't have any relationship really to the physical realm around her outside of the context of her own imagination. And she was really the first person in the Western world to do a body of work that significantly explored these kinds of ideas of expressionism. I want to show like a large version of that painting. See a W here, O, A. Lettering is non-objective. It doesn't necessarily relate, except for the kanji and things like that, it rarely relates directly to the physical world. And so we do see artists in the future that will use lettering within their artwork to kind of pull it away from a naturalistic rendering. So this is all background leading into what we're talking about. And I wanted to visit this through one artist. He's the father of the bridge, or Jugendstil, and his work looks very non-objective. But I wanted to share a little bit about what he did. I wonder if we have time. Yes, we do have time to watch this. Share a little bit about what he did in his artistic evolution. You can see him going through different art movements as he was trying to find a way of processing the rapid technological changes that were going on within his lifespan.
Piet Mondrian's work can sometimes be hard to appreciate. These shuffling colorful squares and these intersecting black lines make his paintings all blend together, as if each of them were unique, yet identical at the same time. But this particular style was only one step in Mondrian's quite linear artistic progression. He was born in 1872 in Amersfoort, Netherlands, and will start painting, just like many other Dutch artists, landscapes. Already then, he adopts unconventional techniques. For example, most Dutch landscapes displayed the famous Netherlands sky and its puffy clouds, but Mondrian, in At Work on the Land, made in 1898, puts the horizon.
Now, even though this is after majority of the realism that we looked at last week, this still kind of fits in that a little bit because we see an ordinary person plowing behind an ordinary horse. It is an unremarkable scene, and we see this element of simplification and stylization that moves towards more contemporary abstraction in this. I just love these fields of color. These areas of color are very interesting to me. They're not naturalistically related to colors of most landscapes. The person, we only know it's a person because we have a face area, hand area, and in the physical context of having a plow behind a horse, we know that there's a good chance that this is a person. So it seems interesting to me that it's a fusion between this idea of just making shapes with the paint that are stylized and using as a subject matter the subject matter that the realist painters did before him. So I don't think I'll stop the video anymore.
Line extremely high, not leaving much space for any clouds. He then explored many different movements such as Impressionism, as seen in Willow Grove, Impression of Light and Shadows, made in 1905. He also explores Post-Impressionism as seen in Evening, Red Tree, completed in 1910, in which we can clearly see the influence coming from Van Gogh. Mondrian also had a Fauvist phase, which will preface the importance of primary colors in his later work. But in 1911, an art movement will heavily influence him. He discovers through Picasso and Braque Cubism and will move to Paris to further his career. In 1911, he paints a first version of still life with ginger pot, and then, the following year, reinterprets the painting in a Cubist style. The intersecting black lines first make their appearance. Mondrian will slowly start to move away from representation, which we can see by comparing his older tree paintings with The Great Tree, painted in 1911. Only 1 year later, he will, again, make one step closer to abstraction with another representation of a tree, Flowering Apple Tree. He will continue to make abstract paintings in Paris until 1914 when, during a visit in the Netherlands, World War I begins, not allowing Mondrian to go back in France. This will make Mondrian meet other Dutch artists such as Bart van der Lek and Theo van Doesburg. Together, they will create the De Stijl movement, in which Mondrian defines neoplasticism. He will write, "As a pure representation of the human mind, art will express itself in an aesthetically purified, that is to say, abstract form. The new plastic idea cannot therefore take the form of a natural or concrete representation. The new plastic idea will ignore the particulars of appearance, that is to say, natural form and color. On the contrary, it should find its expression in the abstraction of form and color, that is to say, in the straight line and the clearly defined primary colors." This will be the birth of the Mondrian we know of today, with the colors and the geometry. But it's only in the 1920s that Mondrian will start painting the iconic compositions. Those will also evolve with time. The first compositions usually had more colors and shapes, and sometimes the black lines wouldn't even reach the edge of the canvas. With time, though, Mondrian purified his work, stripping away more and more elements. His compositions started to include less colors, but sometimes more lines, making his work seem more minimalistic or simplified. Finally, in 1938, with the rise of fascism in Europe, Mondrian moves to London and, in 1940, decides to move to New York City. This will be the last step in Mondrian's artistic evolution. Even though he's 68 when he moves to New York, he's captivated by the energy this city has. The busy streets, the booming culture, and especially jazz music will animate him. The black lines in his compositions will be replaced by colorful lines overlapping each other. The last painting Mondrian completes is called Broadway Boogie Woogie, a representation of the grid-like streets of New York. The lines are vivid, and unlike any other Mondrian paintings, they are continuously interrupted by color. The lines are not continuous anymore. They are extremely busy, almost as if they had a certain rhythm to them. Mondrian wanted to create universal art that, through its harmony and simplicity, could appeal to any individual, no matter their background. By simplifying what he painted, Mondrian broke down his subjects to their core essence, lines, shapes, and colors, and arranged them in order to create balance. You may admire Mondrian's work, or maybe you don't see what's so interesting about his horizontal and vertical lines, but what's less debatable is how fascinating Mondrian's quest for purification is. You might not like his individual artworks, but Mondrian's work, as a whole, is interesting to analyze as it's the work of a lifetime. From the post-impressionist tree to the Cubist branches, all the way to the streets of New York, Mondrian's artistic progress is, in itself, a work of art. We'd like to
I think that is really fascinating, and I want to share something that may help understand a little bit about what's going on with Mondrian. Is some of these images kind of show what the world was turning into. These are just the phone lines. So Mondrian, he was born in 1872, and as he got older and more mature, energy of culture around him became more and more frenetic. And there are, this is just with the phones, but you can imagine trees, not trees, I'm sorry, streets, cars, things like this that didn't, when he was born, um, not an awful lot was happening transportation wise on land other than horse drawn carriages and things like that, and horses and people walking. And as he was growing up, bicycles became super popular, then cars, trains became super popular. Everybody was on that. And culture became more and more frenetic. And what is interesting to me as Pete Mondrian got older is it seems to me that as the culture around him became more energetic, his paintings became more simplified and abstracted to more simplification, which I just think is really amazing. And then this image is something that this is called Nude Descending a Staircase. This is a painting by Marcel Duchamp. And this was done in about, it was before World War One, and I can't remember the exact date. I think it is 1910. Okay. Why is this painting important? In 1910, there's a couple of things that are going on. This is one of the defining images that helped articulate um, uh, what became known as Cubism. So we talked about the frenetic pace of the world with Mondrian as he was simplifying and stylizing everything to the point where his abstraction almost becomes non-objective. Doesn't seem to directly relate to the natural world. That was one way of dealing with it. What Marcel Duchamp was doing is, if you imagine in 1910, Edward Maybridge, his books where he took rapid snapshots of people and animals and objects moving, and this defined the reining in of technology to create cinema, essentially, moving pictures, movies, things like that. Edward Maybridge was able to demonstrate that you could take snapshots of images through time, and your eye, if they were placed in the right order, you could see the object moving again using these static images. So, he was able to demonstrate both of that. And that's because of his work led directly to the awareness that the majority of people will see movement with as few as 24 images being shown in rapid progression in a single second. And that's defined how the technology behind movies. At this time as well, production on all sorts of levels and production design for objects like refrigerators and cars and things like that has become it's people used to work in factories or in shops, and that seemed to be pretty much the choice of jobs you could have. Now people were taking blueprints and building things that other people designed. And this idea that you can have multiple views of the same object as you walk around it started to change people's perceptions. Then you also get Heidegger and Husserl, who philosophically were looking at the world, and one of the ideas that they had was something that is called phenomenology. That comes down to reality is not something that you just passively observe, but they started talking about reality as something that you are an active participant within, whether or not you want to be. That reality means something because observers participate in it and give meaning to it as they think about it. What this means, all these things coming together, is we look at this image. This is the top of the stairs at the left, bottom of the stairs to the right. This is a man walking down the stairs. And if we look at those things, Edward Maybridge snapshots and cinema type film, looking at blueprints where people walk around an object and see multiple perspectives of the thing to help understand it better. And you combine that with the idea that we have the right as human beings, essentially as observing animals, to overlay meaning onto something and actually change the nature of our relationship with that thing. We have the capacity to transform our own experience of reality. And combine all those things together, we see several different elements of that person in different snapshots as they're moving down the staircase. This is earlier in time, this is more recent in time. We can see the waist and the bottom of the person moving. We can see the knee of the moving. We can see the light glinting off in different sections as their right foot is moving and changing angles. You can kind of see their shoulder right here. You can see their shoulder again right here. You can see their head tilting forward. You can see side of their head right here. So Marcel Duchamp is combining not just snapshots of an individual moving down the stairs, but also as the light changes, we're seeing different moments of time at the same moment. We're seeing different perspectives at the same time. Here we see a little bit more of the person's back. Here we see a little bit more of the person's profile. And then combining all that, Marcel Duchamp, he's not just presenting a finished image for us to accept. What he is asking us, inviting us to do, is to take an active role in defining the meaning of this image. He's expecting us, he's requiring us to be intelligent enough to try to look at this, to be, he's expecting us to be smart enough to know that we need to participate in what this image means as well as we're looking at it. And I think that that is absolutely fascinating because he is no longer presenting a finished product for us as a viewer to look at. He is inviting us and expecting us as intelligent viewers to participate in the development along with him of the meaning of the image. And all three of those things together, different perspectives, different points through time, and expecting us to participate in the image. All the three of those things are really amazing and are indicative of how artists are transforming their relationship with the audience and transforming our relationship to viewing their art as well by expecting us to be an active participant. Now, we did look at this video already. I'd like people to go back and look at that again. What I'm going to do is go through several of these as we get closer to the modern time, and we can kind of see this is a period of time between about 1880 and about 1920, and all of these movements are happening very rapidly as different artists are focusing on different elements of culture within which they live, and they're each addressing different aspects of the world that people live within. Like we mentioned, Pete Mondrian, is one of his concerns is how ridiculously active the world is. And that's one of the reasons that motivate him to making more and more simplified images, which is horizontal and vertical lines. And Marcel Duchamp requires us to be an active participant in viewing the image and developing meaning with it. And we'll also see how these movements respond to different things like burgeoning awareness of how ocular science works, the rods and cones in the eye, how time is manifested, things like surface level reading of developing nuclear and radiation theories. You know, this is about the time that people start developing the ideas that lead into X-ray machines. And then we're also talking about how do you address a world that is increasingly more active in both travel and communication technologies. All these things are coming together. So I want to, we looked at a little bit about the cityscape painting earlier. This is another video that I want to watch really quick here. It's 6 minutes long, but I think it's worthwhile because it addresses the idea, how do you participate in the development of understanding with an image. And this, we're particularly looking at impressionism that is pointillist. And there is not going to be, I'm not going to do quizzes or anything like that about all these different art movements. What I would like you to do is for each of the art movements, at least look at some of the paintings and watch one of the videos about them. At least do that. And because I just want you to get kind of an understanding of what's going on. I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, and I'm not holding you responsible for understanding completely every element that we're looking at, but I do want you to get an awareness of a lot of very different people are processing the world, the changes in the world around them in very different ways, and expressing themselves, sometimes with abandon, in such a way because their artistic predecessors have not had the freedom to display for others to see the world as they see it, as the artist sees it. So we're going to watch this video really quick here.
People usually spend less than a minute looking at a single artwork. Most spend no more than 5 seconds. That was 5 seconds. Do you remember much of that painting? How would you describe it? Do you remember the details? It's absolutely fine to browse and wander through an art museum, but when you stop to spend 5 to 10 minutes with one artwork to discuss it with someone, it can change how you see, how you think, and how you appreciate that object.
One of the things I've talked about in this class is the Feldman model for artistic critique, and that is where we describe, we analyze, we interpret, and we evaluate. And I want you, the narrator of this is not using that exact same framework, but they're doing something that's very parallel to it. So please be mindful as you listen to this, look for those elements. What are they describing? How are they analyzing? Are they interpreting? And when do they start evaluating the image? So think about those things as we go forward.
Let something catch your eye. It might be something you like. It might even be something you dislike. Stop to figure out what caught your eye. Start seeing. Seeing requires you to use your brain to direct your eye, to ask questions, and to process information. Take in a full view. You don't need to look at the label first. You don't really need that information right now. Just enjoy moving your eye around the artwork. Then pick a starting point. Here, maybe it's the center group. Why does your eye move there? Try to figure it out. That red of her scarf, it's the only red in the midst of green, blue, white, and gray. The group is almost, though not quite, in the center of the image. The sloping lines of the trees on either side and the diagonal line of the wall and the street lead me right to that group. I feel like I'm on the same street. It's probably not a picture of today if I look at what they're wearing, and there are no cars on the road. I think they're standing in the shadow, but of what? Trees, maybe? Or a building? It makes me think of the tower of a cathedral. It's a strong shadow, so the light must be bright. I want a closer look. If I step about 12 inches away and just look at the paint, the brush strokes, I can almost see the artist adding one dab of color on top of another. That gray isn't just gray, it's blue over the gray and green mixed with the blue. I even see a few dots of orange around their feet. and then maybe more orange up in the trees. And then again, up in the hillside. The white of the road is painted differently, with longer brush strokes. The faces aren't detailed, they're just blobs of color. How does the artist know where to put those blobs of color so that it looks like a face? Let's put it all back together again. If I back up, this painting looks really different from a distance than it does up close. The edges and shapes look so solid from here, but I now know that they're made up of small dots of many colors. It's similar to the painting to the left, with all those dabs of color, but it seems a little more controlled maybe. And it's similar to the painting to the right, with the same colors and a road, but different brush strokes. Now let's look at the label. So it's by Léon Porteau, a French artist, and it was painted in 1891. He was young when he died, only 30. And on the painting in the lower right, LP 91. So that's the artist's name and the year it was painted. I guess I never thought about how the landscape can be broken into these big shapes, or how many different colors can appear in the landscape. A green tree isn't just one shade of green, it's many shades of green, and the blue between the leaves of the sky. Maybe this makes me more observant of everything around me, even when I'm outside the museum. So, as you wander the museum, take time to stop and focus your attention on a single artwork, because it deserves more than 5 seconds.
I really like that, and because they are able to really talk about it. There was a guy in 1950s named Clement Greenberg that said if you don't get it immediately, it's not worth getting, essentially. And I don't like that because, as with everything, when you take your time, you end up and think about it, whatever potential meanings there are expand. Your awareness of what's going on expand. And I think the difference is my Airedale, um, she will eat her entire dinner in like 4 seconds, and I doubt she's tasted it at all. And when my wife and I go to a really fun restaurant, it's enjoyable to just taste everything and let the flavors kind of set in our mouths and enjoy the ambience and the smells and things like that. And it makes it the whole event, rather than just consuming calories, it becomes an enjoyable experience. And I think that that's the big difference. At the Phoenix Art Museum, that video is talking about savoring and participating in a development of understanding as opposed to just glancing and moving on. Because I think that I don't think that necessarily shows a lot of respect to the artist themselves. I do want you to watch this. This is an art movement called Dadaism. Well, this actually is a timeline of art, and I think that this is important because it does talk about different stuff from the art periods that we were looking at to more contemporary times, romanticism, realism, those kinds of things, to a more modern stuff. But if you don't want to watch that, you can also watch either of these. I really like this Industrial Revolution timeline of art because you can kind of see how things relate to different developments of art movements as well. So we're looking at a lot of different kinds of imagery, early photography, how that relates, all that kind of stuff too. So definitely check out some of these timeline links that I provide. And again, it's going from Renaissance to, or in this case, prehistory, but from where our class started, more towards today. And this is where we start getting into Romanticism, what we talked about, realism. And then we're going to look at some other of these art movements now really quickly. And again, I'm just trying to give you kind of an overview because we will concentrate on some of this stuff before, but I think you need to have this kind of visual vocabulary as we move forward so you know what kinds of stuff we're referencing. I have the videos here so that you guys can look at the videos, but I also have links like a lot of really good stuff from the Met Museum where it shows Art Nouveau. Now, Art Nouveau, we're talking about 1890 to about 1920, 1910, 1920. This is a time period where people are developing beautiful objects for the people that benefited from the Industrial Revolution by having middle income, but they are taking stylized realism without abstracting it beyond understanding. They're just trying to show, like particularly with Art Nouveau, they are trying to bring the beauty of the natural world using industrial materials into the home. That's the point behind Art Nouveau. And this is why you'll see, now this has a lot of links to imagery on that one, and that's just an article that talks about it. But as we look at some of these, some of the art itself, I'm going to blow this up so you can see. I want you to be able to see that there is definitely, let's see, there's a lot of these natural kind of forms. And this is Gaudi, I believe. But I hope you can see, it looks to me like there's undersea forms. There looks to be like coral type forms or maybe little areas from lily pads and stuff like that brought into using industrial materials, but taking these natural, stylized natural forms and bringing them into a livable space. So perhaps this is a response to so much brick and cement being used to make housing. Having something like this is just a beautiful object that has these delicate lines that are heavily inspired by natural branches, natural leaf shapes, and things like that. But this is what defines the Art Nouveau movement. And you can see it would be very unusual to see flowers growing like this in the natural world, but they're taking, these artists are taking elements out of the natural world and putting it into through industrial processes. Like this is particularly, I think, a lithograph print. That's the same kind of technology that was used to make board games and money. And this person is making it so that you can have a beautiful painting like this in a poster form. Before it was really fashionable to do that, several years later. And they're taking these natural forms, bringing it into an accessible space that anybody can put this up on the wall or use it for advertising. This is an example of advertising. When you see how they stylize the hair, where it just is this elegant, free-flowing thing where it almost looks like it's floating in water, but it's simplified and stylized. You still have it looks very realistic, but it elevates this kind of simplification to the point where it just looks incredibly elegant. We have Art Deco, which happened about the same time. This is a similar treatment, except it is very much inspired by design elements of ancient Egypt. Egypt was all the rage in Europe. Everybody who wanted to be anybody wanted to have something that looked vaguely Egyptian, and that heavily inspired a lot of Art Deco. And Art Deco, again, is one of these things where they're using industrial materials, regular, ordinary industrial building materials, but trying to develop a sense of elegance and bring in aspects of natural decoration into a shared space. Let's see. I'm sorry, I thought I was sharing a bunch of stuff with you, and it looks like, okay, here we go. And so there's elements of Art Deco that really bring Egyptian elements into it, and I hope you can see with this painting, there's these stylized leaves, but they kind of are reminiscent of the tops of painted columns in Egypt, like in the Temple of Karnak. This is a example of decorative arts that are inspired by Egyptian temples and construction and stuff like that, using industrial processes, but making it in such a way so it doesn't look heavily industrial. This is an interior setting, and you can see decorations like this that again look vaguely Egyptian. That's what's inspired by it. And even lettering was designed to have this kind of formal elegance that reminds you of things like greyhound dogs and other stuff like that. Arts and crafts was a movement that kind of critiqued this industrialization, where it's objects that people live with are made with lines borrowed from nature and things. So there's a lot of cross-pollinating between Art Nouveau, Art Deco, and arts and crafts because they were all kind of considered parallel, very similar types of things. And this is where elements of personal touches, personal construction, unique elements of unique design are implemented into the objects being created so they don't feel industrial, even though they're being industrial processes are used. Like this, the wood is very specifically stained so that different elements really pop out as yellow blotches. And these leaves, this is carved and then almost enameled so that these leaves kind of shine. So you still have this kind of formal elegance element, but it's heavily inspired by natural forms. This almost looks medieval, the way it's done. And then if you look closer, you can see the inspiration of vinage, which I think is really fascinating. And in this case, the inspiration of nature is the way that the wood is stained and polished. It really brings out the natural elements of the wood. And different, you look at the forms of these cross braces, they have a little bit more of an organic line to it than just a standard straight edge. And the stained glass chandelier, where you get elements drawn specifically from the natural world, placed in these curving shapes, where these spires are reminiscent of branches fused with rib cages almost. And stylized flowers that repeat, stylized branches. It almost looks like a Japanese painting. Stylized forms that this does not, you don't see a lot of this in the natural world, but it seems it's a stylized abstraction of seed pods and leaves and different things like that, with colors very specifically chosen to have a relationship to the natural world. And this, I love prairie style houses. Frank Lloyd Wright is a guy who really defined this in the same way that Marcel Duchamp defined Dadaism and was a big proponent of Cubism. This prairie style in architecture is the first architectural style that was uniquely American. And it is based on this, again, using industrial materials with heavy inspiration from nature. And I want to see if we could find, I'm sorry, the images are not loading up very rapidly. So I'm going to try to find something that demonstrates the combination of inspiration of natural forms with industrial materials. See if I can find that. And it's, again, I'm sorry that the internet is not loading very quickly in Canvas right now. It looks like we're having a hard time seeing some of these images. But I hope you can see that there are a lot of elements of these different art movements that we're looking at that overlap with each other. Okay, this is not a very good. Oh, what happened? Okay, it's not showing for me. I don't understand why the internet has chosen to stop working on us. But please do take the time to watch this. In Prairie Style, you'll see elements again of using industrial materials that um, that are heavily informed by natural things. And the reason why it's called Prairie Style is that um, it is heavily influenced by shapes like ryegrass and wheat and wisteria, plant forms that are seen in the American plains and on American prairies, but stylized and abstracted to the point where they make specific and repeatable angles coming together. And so in prairie style windows, you'll see stylizations like this, where in this case, there's some of these Art Nouveau kind of lines coming through. These are windows that are designed to look like branches in a tree with occasional leaves. That's one type of prairie style. And then prairie style architecture that Frank Lloyd Wright did uses a lot of wisteria and ryegrass to specifically. So you get a lot of these concentrated diagonals. Now, I also want you to look at Impressionism. And Impressionism is important. This happened as people are processing realism and romanticism. So starts happening about 1870, 1860, right around there. And instead of being entirely naturalistic, artists are painting areas of color. They're not trying to define entire forms. Here we do have this person is pretty well defined, but you look at these flowers here, and they're spots of color instead of drawn out uh, plants. And the ocean waves, they're giving an impression of the reflections on the water as opposed to trying to define the water with the paint. And this is where the name comes from. They're giving you impressions of how does the light bounce off of this? What are the colors that we see on this castle? What are the impressions about the posture of the person? They're not trying to give you specific, relatable, naturalistic contours and shapes. They're giving you impressions of color areas and mood. And this is a really good example. Look at the water. We really dissect this water. It's just blobs of color. But the way that this artist has done that, it's amazing to me because all of us have experienced this kind of subtle wave on a pond where it feels like a gentle wind blowing across the surface of the water as opposed to making significant waves. And that's what really defines Impressionism. It's named because the artists are giving you an impression of a feeling or colors or how light affects things. Now, Post-Impressionism, it's called Post-Impressionism because the artists are responding to what was going on with Impressionism. And we get a lot of different kinds of things in this, where we have simplified shapes. We have radical approaches to developing images with small strokes. Or this is called pointillism, this right here, where the entire thing is painted just with little dots of color. All these are responses to what artists were doing in Impressionism. They're artists that are giving themselves permission to show you the world as they see it, as they interpret it. Now, Fauvism, if we look at, let's see if we can find an image. Yes, okay. With Fauvism, the artists are exploring, well, what kinds of different things can we do with color? Because this is the first time that all these colors were incredibly cheap for an artist to get. So they're exploring ideas. Well, if I see a little bit of red, I'm going to just make the whole area red. If I see a little bit of a cool shadow, I'm going to turn the whole thing green, for example, or blue or whatever represents cool. They are getting away from a restriction of color being what people expect. And the reason it's called Fauvism is fauve is Russian for, or I'm sorry, French for animal or beast. And what is interesting about this is when critics were looking at this, they said, yeah, this doesn't look like a real painting. This looks like you gave a brush to an animal and had them do it. And that's where the name came from. That it looks like they're paintings done by animals. And Impressionism is the artist sharing impressions of color, form, and things like that. Post-Impressionism are artists that were responding to what was popular among these things. Fauvism is people just demonstrating that color can be anything and that the imagery develops meaning because the context you give it as an observer. Expressionism, this is when people are not giving impressions anymore. They're trying to show what they think about the scene. This is why we have Edvard Munch's Scream here, is that he was trying to express a lot of the depression and hopelessness that people around him were going through. This was developed around the time of the world wars, when the entire world was changing, and it was changing violently. And Egon Schiele, who did this painting, instead of just painting a person, a man or a woman, he was trying to paint with his use of color, the splotchy skin areas. He was trying to paint what are their emotions as well. He's trying to show their personal expression in the paint. All right, this link seems to be working a little bit, but this gives you a number of different artists that worked in there, men and women. And this is where you start trying to really demonstrate by the use of color the shapes of the strokes, the energy of the areas that you're showing. You're trying to communicate expressions of emotion with that. So we get this person looks very depressed. And a lot of that comes from the expression of these garish colors in the sky, the way that the figure kind of waves, and how the hands kind of morph into these odd shapes. So again, he's stylizing and simplifying, he's abstracting forms. The Blue Rider is a really famous painting where I don't know what the emotions are that are being expressed, but I hope you can see that the colors are not exactly what you expect for a fully naturalistic rendering. And the shapes are distorted a little bit. They're simplified, they're stylized, they're abstract. All those words lead into abstraction. Now this looks to me like Fauvism as well, where you have these really bright colors. The horses are blue, for example. But this merges with Expressionism too, because the way the colors are overlapped, they start feeling like things, or they start expressing feelings instead of just imagery. So I'd like you to go through that and see what you think. But as you move forward, I mentioned that I removed. I hope this kind of makes sense. I want you to go through each of those art movements that I show you. I want you to look at one of the videos. Just watch one of the videos and maybe one of the article links as well, and just kind of look at them and get a feeling for them, because we're going to depend on that vocabulary a little bit as we move forward. We're not going to heavily use it, but I want you to be aware of where it fits, and we'll explore these things in a little bit more detail as we move forward. So we have Research and Discovery Project 5, but you'll notice that I removed Research and Discovery Project 6. I don't want you do that. I've removed that assignment. You're no longer responsible for it. And so we only have 5 of the projects that are 3 to 5 hours, and then we still do have the final capstone project. And on this one, you are supposed to submit the proposal by this weekend. I'm going to change that since we're getting rid of one of those projects, the 6th one. I'm going to change this. The project proposal is where you tell me what you want to do. And I may give you advice as to, that's too much work. It only needs to be 10 hours, or what are the things that you're going to do to fluff it out to fit the 10 hours. So I am going to change this so that the data is a little bit more, a little bit farther into the future. But you will need to email me as soon as you can with your idea for your proposal. And I do that because I want to make sure that you turn in something that is within the scope of our class, and it's not so much work that you can't finish it. Or on the other side, to make sure that it's the right amount of work for this thing. I'm also going to be finalizing the AI project opportunity or option. Nobody's required to do it at all, but it is going to be an option that I'm going to apply to the discovery project area of the project descriptions. So please let me know if you come across anything that relates to the 6 projects plus the final. Let me know so I can change that to 5 projects plus the final. And if you have any questions, email me so I can clarify it, and we'll talk through it more on Tuesday. So, all right. Well, thanks for joining me today. Thanks for being a part of the process. And if you have any questions responding to this video or anything like that, feel free to reach out. Oh, the in-class final. Colton just asked me as well about the in-class final. Notice that it's not published. And it's not published because for 2 things. We're not going to have an in-class final. The final for this is actually going to be something that you're going to be emailed, or this is going to be open so that you can respond to it on the first day of finals. You'll have a whole week to respond to the questions and then get the answers back to me. And we'll talk more about that later. But it is not in class because we're online. When I teach this in class, then it is the in-class final. So yeah, good catch, Colton. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to explain that. All right, guys, I hope you have a wonderful week and weekend, and I really look forward to visiting more on Tuesday. Like I said, I'm going to change the due date on the proposal, and this proposal is going to be you email me about your idea for your final capstone project. I email you back, and that short conversation you copy, put into a document, and that document is what you submit to get these points. Sorry, and we'll talk more about that next week too. All right, have a good week and weekend, and I look forward to visiting with everybody next Tuesday.